Germany, April 16, 1945, and 4 days of hell are about to begin as the Soviets begin their assault on the stronghold that the Seelow Heights has become. This natural defensive position overlooking the Oder River was only part of the major Soviet offensive that would see the Red Army push to Berlin in their drive to capture the so-called gates of Berlin. But this crucial river crossing would see bitter fighting and the clash of the Soviet juggernaut in some of the few remaining organised German forces. So let's see how this all unfolded. The plan to cross the Oder River and push through the Seelow Heights to Berlin was no easy task, but the Soviet Field Marshal, Georgy Zhukov, if I'm saying that correctly, I do believe I am, in charge of this operation, it was in good hands. He was a competent and smart man who had many successors and had proven himself on many occasions. He also had the full support of Joseph Stalin himself, who had backed this plan over another, with it being the most promising and quickest way for the Soviet forces to push towards Berlin and end the war, especially before the Western Allies could gobble up more territory. With the go-ahead for his plan, Zhukov moved to build up his forces. He rapidly constructed 23 bridges over the Oder River and operated 40 ferries, and by mid-April he has assembled 41 divisions, around 768,000 men, 3,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, also 17,000 artillery pieces, with around 1,400 of them being rocket launchers. This massive force capable of unleashing mayhem on their German opponents. But as this army was ready for its offensive, the German defenders were not sitting on their hands. The German forces, led by Colonel Gotthard Heinrici, who was in charge of the defences of the Seelow Heights, he had Army Group Vistula at his command. This force, which comprised of the 3rd Panzer Army to the north and 9th Army to the south, was a fairly large force comprising of around 110,000 soldiers and around 512 tanks and assault guns, 2,800 artillery pieces, and a small number of aircraft, as the Luftwaffe was pretty devastated by this point in the war. The force had one major issue. It contained large amounts of inexperienced Volkssturm units to bulk out its ranks after heavy losses throughout the last few months. These troops were green and could not be counted on compared to more battle-hardened troops. Gotthard was a fantastic defensive tactician, and he knew that his forces would need major defensive fortifications to have any hope of holding the Soviets back. So immediately, he began constructing 3 defensive lines. These were comprised of trenches, bunkers, pillboxes, and all major defensive structures, with the second line having many heavy anti-tank weapons to cut through Soviet tanks, and the last of these defensive lines being the famous Wotan Line. He also ordered his engineers to open the dams on the Oder River to cause the land around Seelow Heights to become boggy and swamp-like. Gotthard also did something a little unusual with his forces. He gave up the riverbank and only had a light skirmishing force to hold it, and concentrated the majority on the high ground at Seelow. He traded territory for lives and tried to maximise the natural defences as much as possible. So April 16th began, and at 3 a.m. Marshal Zhukov ordered the Soviet artillery to unleash hell. This artillery bombardment was insane, with over 500,000 artillery shells and rockets being unleashed upon the German defenders in around 30 minutes. But there was a slight issue, as the Soviet artillery was mainly aimed at the first German defence line, which normally would be perfect, but Gotthard had anticipated this and pulled the majority of his forces back to the second defence line to wait out the bombardment and reduce casualties. Also of note is that Zhukov reported to Stalin that the bombardment had been very effective in killing many German troops and pinning them in the trenches, unable to move at all, and all evidence points to this to being false. But this bombardment did shatter large amounts of the first defence line, creating gaps for Soviet troops to push through, so it did serve its main purpose, and it terrified the more inexperienced German troops with its ferocity. This quote says it all. Helmut Altner, a young German conscript, recalled, "The thunder of the cannon merges into a single roar. Everything into the air howls, whistles, trembles, and buzzes. We are in a huge cauldron. Hell is in front of us, around us, and behind us. The Russians are beating our trenches like a drum. Shells screech and they cut the air and explode. Raised to their feet, the refugees look like ghosts. Women, children, and old people, not awake, half-dressed. On their faces, despair and mortal, indescribable fear." Now the bombardment had stopped, Soviet forces surged forward just before dawn, pushing through the lowlands, but the release of water from the dams had turned the ground into a quagmire, and Soviet forces began to quickly get bogged down. This allowed the German defenders who had remanned their positions in the first trench line to begin hitting the Soviets hard. But the Red Army had a trick up its sleeve. It had brought 143 very powerful searchlights to help illuminate German positions, especially concealed ones. Now, the reports of the effectiveness of these searchlights were mixed. First, the dust kicked up by the bombardment limited the illuminating capabilities. They also made the advancing Soviet troops stand out to the defenders, with some more or less confirmed reports saying the Soviet troops believed they were deployed to stop men retreating by being blinded by them if they turned their backs, which I think is more of an accident of the searchlight's use rather than its intended effect. But all evidence points towards them being more detrimental to the Soviet attack than useful, but still an outside-the-box tactic which I can respect. With the first elements of the Soviet force getting bogged down and political pressure from the Kremlin to break the Seelow Heights as quickly as possible, Zhukov was in a tough position. So he reluctantly ordered the reserve forces to join the battle in an attempt to break through with speed. But with so many forces attempting to get to the battle, roads became jammed with communication and command breaking down, and these reserves being delayed and unable to help the bogged down troops for now. This meant the Soviets' attack began to stall, even though they had advanced to the first defence line and had made progress, and not allowed German counterattacks to push them back. Unfortunately, a single day breakthrough of the whole Seelow Heights was not going to happen. But I think Zhukov knew this, deep down, and only politicians in the Kremlin with little military knowledge thought it would be possible to sweep through such a fortified position in a single day. With the first day wrapping up and the early hours of April 17th beginning, Soviet artillery had advanced forward and began to smash into the second line with renewed precision. This did great damage to the defensive structures and pinned the troops down, making counterattacks very difficult. And fresh Soviet troops were now leading the assault. They pushed through no man's land into the second line of defences and began the tough tug of war over full control over these positions. As they advanced, the Soviets made great use of smoke screens to blind German positions and limit their casualties from in-place weapons. And also, as the Soviets advanced, the German counterattacks were launched. They did delay the Soviet forces, but they came at a high cost, losing men and even more precious tanks, which were in such a finite resource for Germany now. And in the skies, the Luftwaffe attempted to hold the ground forces back with close air support, but the Red Army had near air superiority, and all the German air forces could do is harass the enemy ground forces at best. There was no chance they could outdo the Soviet Air Force. It had superior firepower and numbers. As the battle raged on, the Soviet engineers had the difficult job of clearing the extensive minefields and obstacles which were slowing down the troops and especially Soviet tanks. But they made significant progress, which would benefit not only movement in the battle, but for supplies and logistics in future. And by the end of the second day, the Soviets had advanced, but the stiff German resistance combined with the tough terrain had stopped a major breakthrough. But the Soviets were now in a good position with their forces prepared to not give the Germans a chance to regroup or launch any major counterattacks. On April 18th, the third day of the battle began, and the Soviets kept up the pressure. This was in essence Zhukov's main strategy, to use the Soviets' superior numbers and firepower to keep the Germans under intense pressure. This would not allow them to regroup or launch major counterattacks. So as the infantry slogged through the defences, Soviet tank crews were told to exploit any breakthroughs. Even though risky to rush ahead, if done in the right places, they could cut off large amounts of German troops. As this was happening, notable German counterattacks did take place, with one being led by the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland. This force was in relatively good shape and held off the Soviets for a small time, but it did take heavy casualties and lost viable armoured vehicles. The bulk of the German forces, though, were very inexperienced and weary after constant days of bombardment and large amounts of brutal fighting. This led to morale plummeting and the lines began to buckle all over, and Gotthard knew it. He ordered all forces to withdraw and regroup at more tenable defensive positions, but with the Soviets swarming and supply lines and lines of potential retreat being hit, these positions were turning into what the Soviets called cauldrons, which were part of the Soviet encirclement doctrine. As these German forces withdrew from the second defence line totally, the Soviets were able to capitalise on the abandonment of these strong fortifications, and they captured large amounts of ground and reached the third defence line, the Wotan Line. And to the Germans' dismay, they found that the Soviet forces were now beginning to outflank and even bypass the Seelow Heights defensive line, turning this bad situation even worse. April 19th and the final Soviet push through the defences began. The Soviets knew the German defenders were beginning to retreat, and now they held nothing back. They stormed forward to try and cut off as many as possible, as every German killed or captured here was one less to have to fight in Berlin. The sheer amount of Soviet armour and troops could not be stemmed, and they pushed through any gaps in the defences, causing chaos, with many German troops being totally cut off and the more inexperienced troops surrendering once they knew there was no way out. And the remnants of the German Ninth Army were now encircled, as the German forces that could escape were retreating chaotically, as the Soviets killed or captured anyone unlucky enough to be cut off at the Seelow Heights. and by the evening of the 19th, the Heights were firmly in control of the Soviets, with only the most fanatical of German defenders putting up any resistance, which was soon eliminated. But the casualties on both sides were high. With the Germans suffering around 12,000 casualties, this is a combination of all killed, captured, and missing in combat. They also lost significant amounts of supporting tanks and anti-tank guns and artillery that was destroyed or captured as they fell back. The Soviets suffer higher casualties, as expected with attacking such a fortified position, with their casualties being around 33,000 killed or missing, with hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns being destroyed as well. And these casualties could have been much lower if the Kremlin and Stalin himself had not pressured Zhukov to capture the Seelow in a panic to take Berlin before the Western Allies could. And I believe if given more time to tactically assault the Heights, Zhukov could have reduced the casualties of the Soviet forces by around 30 to 50%, as he was a competent commander and he knew his mission well. In the aftermath of the Battle of Seelow Heights, we saw a full collapse of the Germans' last major defence in the east, and the Soviet forces opened up a major corridor of attack towards their final goal of Berlin, now only 60 kilometres away. Also, the destruction of the Ninth Army and breaking of major German forces, leaving them a shadow of themselves and ineffective to do much else in the remainder of World War II. The battle also showed the effective combined arms tactics which the Soviets had perfected, but also how even with inferior numbers and poor troops, how a defender with good preparation can cause major casualties to an attacking force. And finally, one of the most important lessons from the battle is that pressure from political elements can cause just as much as an effect on a battle than the situation from the front, and even a good general such as Zhukov had to do as his bosses wished, and sometimes this amounted to lives lost and poor tactical decisions at the behest of politicians with no military knowledge. Hope you enjoyed this video, enjoyed bringing it to you. Try and be as accurate as possible with all the info. Obviously, try and make sure everything's correct. Some things may not be. If anything's missed, leave a comment. As long as you're polite, I'll respond, which is fair. Obviously, discuss nicely between yourselves as well, as history can get a bit heated. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. You guys have a fantastic evening.